evening. I am the Maven of the Eventide, and welcome to Vampire Reviews. It's here! The trailer for AMC's TV show version of Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire finally dropped last weekend at San Diego Comic-Con, and reactions have been mixed. A lot of people are just now finding out about the show for the first time, and they were completely thrown for a loop by all the very obvious changes it's making to the source material, which we have discussed here previously on Vampire Reviews. But many people who were well aware of the time period shift and character ethnicity and backstory changes and so on, and had been fearing the show would be a disrespectful mess stomping on the soul of a beloved franchise, were pleasantly surprised. As far as trailers go, as a trailer, it is a damn good trailer, just like from a sheer cinematic perspective, full of moody, gothic atmosphere, ambiance, excitement, tension, drama, intrigue, and romance. Especially romance. Dark, twisted, bloody, violent vampire romance. And tonight, we are going to examine every last frame of this trailer, and I'm going to tell you, to the best of my considerable knowledge, exactly what we are looking at here. Because, my friends, I have been following the development of this show very, very closely. This franchise might have taken over my entire life. This should already be incredibly obvious, but be warned, we will be having spoilers. Not all the spoilers, I know, because I know so much, but I am a very generous Maven, and I am capable of some mercy, so I will keep the spoilers just to the ones that are relevant to this trailer. Let me start off by saying that I wasn't really surprised by anything in this trailer. I was already fully aware of all the changes the show was making to the canon story from all the casting notices I'd read, both for the principal actors that I shared with you in the video I made for you last year about the show news, and the very, very many calls for extras for various scenes that were published online in the time since then, all throughout the months they were filming in New Orleans, from the official articles that had been released, as well as the unofficial ones full of leaks and speculation. The academic panel the show's set designer Mara LaParish-Loop participated in last month on Anne Rice's world building through the archives and architecture, and, of course, all the scoops being shared throughout all the Anne Rice fandom outlets across the internet. Who said pandemic hyperfixations were over? For those not yet aware, this adaptation of Interview with a Vampire is an alternate universe, alternate time period version of the story. Think of it like a high school or coffee shop AU fanfic, where the same character ideas and story beats that are taken from the source and placed in a new time and setting. The premise is that the vampire got interviewed in the 1970s, like in the book, and this was the story of the famous 1994 movie starring Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt, but the interviewer got it wrong. So now, in 2022, he comes and interviews the vampire again to get the story right this time, and quite a few things are different, both factually and emotionally. The flashback portions of the story still take place in historical New Orleans, but now, instead of Louis, the vampire being interviewed, starting his story being a white Creole plantation owner in 1791, he is now a black Creole brothel owner in 1910. Changing this character to a black man works well with New Orleans culture, which has always had a huge black and mixed race population. And it also has the added bonus of giving us more black vampires on TV. Yes, please, especially a main character. So often, vampires of color are just the side characters. However, this race change brings up a lot of questions and concerns from a story perspective about how the unbalanced power dynamic in Louis and Lestat's relationship will be handled with a white character dominating or abusing a black one. Many people are also concerned about the show perpetuating the black pimp stereotype by making Louis a brothel owner. Knowing that the showrunners and producers were mostly white men raised some red flags when this was first announced, and this new trailer begins to give us some insight into how the complex nuances of race will be addressed in the show. Louis being black means that many things about his backstory and personality have to change in the story as well. Although brothels as a business enterprise are similar to plantations in that they both exploit people's bodies for the profits of the owner, Louis has no longer inherited generational wealth and his vampirically exploitative business from his fathers before him. Instead, he has gotten into the brothel business entirely on his own bootstraps, which makes him even more vampiric as an individual, beyond benefiting from a systemically vampiric society. The show's creator, Roland Jones, said in an interview with Den of Geek last week, "To be perfectly frank, I didn't know how to tell the plantation owner's story. I wasn't going to be the writer to do that." Which, yes, I think that is responsible of him. As a white man, it is not his story to tell. Let those stories be told now by black voices. But as Mara LaPere-Schloop told us in the Anne Rice world-building panel, Jones was also particularly very interested in another period in New Orleans history that has hardly ever seen any representation in cinema, and this was the era of Storyville. Storyville was a 40-block section of historic New Orleans where prostitution was sanctioned, the red light district, and it only existed for 20 years, from 1897 to 1917, and then it was completely destroyed later. Roland Jones says he chose this era in particular for his AU of the story because of the aesthetic. For heightened gothic drama, this time period had sexiness and a feast for the senses. And I'm sure putting a bunch of sex workers on the screen won't hurt the ratings either, Sexy, sexy ladies is just one of those things that audiences expect with vampires. Never mind that one of the huge things about Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles was that they defied cliche vampire expectations and completely reinvented the genre, but... And this news story, or at least this part of the story, because this TV season is only 7 episodes long and only covers a portion of the book it's based on, and they don't know yet if they're going to get any more seasons to finish telling the whole book. The story follows Louis and Lestat's vampire life together from 1910 until the 1940s. We'll get to see how Louis, as a businessman, copes with the fall of Storyville and prohibition destroying his livelihood and his betrayals by his white business associates. As the Comic-Con recap by Deadline put it, chafing at the limitations of life as a black man in 1900s New Orleans, Louis finds it impossible to resist the rakish Lestat's offer of the ultimate escape, joining him as his vampire companion. Louis' reinvented identity as a black man in this situation now directly leads into his vampire journey, and his blackness is integral to the story. We also already knew that Claudia, the vampire child Louis and Lestat make together to save their tumultuous and failing marriage, has also been rewritten as a black character and has been aged up and is being played by the gorgeous Bailey Bass. She is 19, but she is playing the character as 14, and Roland Jones explained at Comic-Con that this choice was actually made because child labor laws in New Orleans wouldn't permit for them to use an underage actor for the amount of work that the role required, and they were extremely passionate about filming in New Orleans, so they had no choice but to make her older. So now, Claudia is 14 and trapped perpetually in puberty, and her story arc will revolve around her inability to grow out of that frame of mind instead of the trauma of having an eternally small body. So yes, all of this we already knew about the big story and theme changes the series was making, but now we finally get to see some visual representation of all this in the trailer. Before now, we did get a few very short teaser clips, the first airing at the Super Bowl, and then a few more bite-sized bits on the show's official Instagram channel, and one commercial that aired a couple weeks ago during Better Call Saul, if you watched that show. But they were the teasiest of teasers, and we were still all desperate to see how the show would make all these huge changes work. And now, the big one! It's here! And it looks good! And I want to talk to you about it. Like, every single last little bit of it. So, if you are ready, let's begin. The trailer video on AMC's official channel starts with this teaser bit. Watch trailer now. Yes, please, that's why we're here.
I was being hunted.
The voiceover is from a clip that plays later on in the actual trailer, but the visuals are different for this bit. We get 3 shots here. The first was Sam Reed as Lestat approaching the camera, and the "I was being hunted" voiceover gives you the impression it's Louis he's stalking with such a serious look on his face. But it's not. See, Louis is right there behind him in the shot. See him right there? Lestat is actually looming over someone else, but we will get back to that shortly. And we have a shot of Louis's face looking a little anxious, but again, not from any scene in the show where he's actually being hunted, because we can see he has his green vampire eye contacts in. When he's human, when he's actually being hunted, he has the actor Jacob Anderson's natural brown eyes. In this shot, he's already a vampire, but he's still so moody. Oh, Louis. Then we get a shot of Louis as a vampire in a different costume, attacking this man. At first, when I saw this bit, I thought it might be the scene where Louis attacks Alderman Fenwick, who is a new character created for the show, but that scene is much more of a face-off, and Louis does a whole lot worse than just chomp on him. This guy, he looks pretty clueless, and Louis is just going straight for the throat, so he must be someone else, and this picture is pretty blurry, but I'm pretty sure that's not legendary actor John DiMaggio. Okay, so as of like 5 minutes ago, IMDb has finally confirmed that John DiMaggio is in fact cast as the character of Alderman Fenwick, but for a few months there, I could only have my suspicions. When he tweeted during Bendergate about being cast in the show back in February, he kept what part he was playing so secret and mysterious, but Fenwick was my first guess because, well, the part sounded perfect for his talents. And then someone shared this picture of him a few months later from the day he was filming his scene on set. And he's got this very bloody head. And one of the first scenes in the show, at least once the interview portion starts and we leave modern times and flash back into Louis' story, it opens up with Fenwick's head bleeding because he has abused a sex worker and she bashed him in the brains. And Louis, who owns the brothel where it happened, has to help him and keep his scandalous affairs secret, which leads them to becoming business partners. So I saw this bloody head and I knew I had to be right about my guess. And now IMDb has him listed, so I was right. Love it when that happens. But anyway, this character Louis is eating here must be someone else. And I don't think they put something as spoilery as the fight with Fenwick in the trailer anyway, or like any major character deaths. So my guess is that this guy is just some random victim, but go Louis. Get him, the hunted becomes the hunter, and this is already setting the tones for the show's themes of shifting power dynamics. The trailer proper opens in a church that's closed after hours, with Louis pounding on the door, saying, "Father, I'm gonna die, help me," and the priest comes to answer.
Help me, please.
When we see Louis' face, he's distraught and very wet. I mean, if Louis isn't crying alone in the pouring rain, is he even Louis at all? He has clearly been running for a while, and he has his natural brown eyes, so we know he's still human at this point.
Help me, please. He's in my head, Father.
He's in my head. He's talking about Lestat here. Who's there inside his mind? Like the Phantom of the Opera. Yes, I went there. As a vampire, Lestat has psychic mind-reading powers, and he can also speak to humans in their minds, work vampire spells on their senses, hypnotize him. But once he makes Louis into a vampire, he can no longer do this because their minds are blocked to each other as maker and fledgling. From Louis' distress here, we get the impression that Lestat's been stalking and tormenting and chasing him, really messing with his head like the super vampire creep he is, which is a very different start to their relationship from the book already. In another article recapping the San Diego Comic-Con panel, Roland Jones was noted as saying that the 1994 film didn't have as much time to follow Lestat's seduction of Louis as a human and the development of their relationship during that time, which the show will deal with in more depth. Now, I always love me some depth, but the reason the 1994 movie didn't follow that seduction in depth is because there is no time to it in the book. Lestat absolutely rushes into making Louis a vampire. There is no courtship, seduction, or hunt. He spends one night explained to Louis what being a vampire is all about. The good, the bad, and the bloody. And then he gives Louis until the next sunset to make up his mind. If Louis says yes, he gets immortality, superpowers, eternal damnation, and a fun vampire life partner. But if he says no, he dies. Now, the TV show is going to be stretching out their time together before Lestat makes Louis a vampire because, as the Comic-Con panel and all the other interviews and press releases have hammered home for us since last weekend, this show is going to be a love story. As Rowland Jones said in his interview, the fluid sexuality of the books is aggressive subtext in the first book. But by the time you get to books 8 and 9, it was the love affair of the century. Without spoiling too much, a subtext becomes text in our show, if you know what I mean. Books 8 and 9. I don't think those were the books that you meant to talk about, Rowland Jones. Aggressive subtext, yes. There are tons of people who have read the book and watched the movie who immediately see how very, very gay the story is. But there are, believe it or not, countless others out there with straight goggles on who insist somehow it is not gay at all and never has been. You could tell that Anne Rice herself was even frustrated with this latter reading of her work, because in the second book, The Vampire Lestat, she has Lestat tell the reader directly that his relationship with Louis was romantic, and even insists that Louis never said it wasn't, and advises the audience to go back to Louis's book and read between the lines. Do it. In one of my favorite quotes by Anne Rice talking about her writing, she states that Louis and Lestat were clearly married to each other when they were rearing Claudia. Word of God. Of course, they do break up, rather famously. There's a lot of hate and anger and resentment there, along with the romance and passion. It's a vampire relationship. Vampires are gonna vampire. And the joke is that Louis's entire interview is just him complaining for endless hours to this random guy he met in a bar about his ex. But as we know from later books in the series, Louis and Lestat do come back together. And eventually, a genuine and healthy love grows between them, you know, as far as vampires go. It only takes them 2.5 centuries, but they eventually get there. Their initial relationship is horribly toxic and fraught and imbalanced and painful, of course. Nobody is calling these guys relationship goals, but these are the exact sort of shenanigans we want from our monsters, from our gothic romance. Emphasis on the gothic. And I, for one, am so excited by how unambiguously romantic the show is making the story, because diversity in queer rep on TV is so needed right now. If I was surprised by anything in the trailer, it was how hard it goes on the gay. From what I'd read and heard about the show beforehand, I knew the characters talk about being canonically bisexual and that they kiss at least once and they tell other characters that they're in a relationship and other characters know this, but I was afraid the show was going to keep most of their actual relationship off screen and largely just allude to it for the sake of making bigoted audiences comfortable. I mean, it's a valid fear. Shows to that. And now, seeing from the trailer how much gay they are actually putting on the screen has wiped that cynicism away from me, so I am so here for it. But back to my original point. The beginning of their relationship was rushed and harried and blundering in the books, and they get off to a very bad start, and the show is taking it in the opposite direction. In the Comic-Con panel, Sam Reed said that Lestat wants to make sure Louis loves him before he makes him a vampire, and we see quite a lot more of this seduction in the trailer. Next, we get the AMC logo and cut to a panning shot of the set. This is the set of Storyville Mara Lepere-Schloop discussed designing in her panel. Because Storyville was completely torn down, they had to build the whole thing, and they did it on a lot in Chalmette about 20 minutes outside New Orleans, and people have done nothing but rave about the amazingness of this set. Although they filmed a bunch of scenes on location in New Orleans French Quarter, Jackson Square, some historical houses in City Park, they had to build 3 different streets of Storyville completely from scratch. This is the fancy street we're seeing here, where the upscale brothels are, but they also built the poor side of town. Up on the balconies here, you see the sex workers displaying themselves and waiting for customers to come into the brothels. And as someone who was fearing that the show chose this particular era just for the sake of putting sex workers on screen to titilize the male gaze and boost their ratings, I am pleased to see how clothed these ladies of the night are. Here is a close-up of them entertaining some sailors on the balcony and having a wonderful time because it's 1910 and Storyville is in its prime and the war hasn't started yet. Inside the brothel, there's roulette and cigars to be had by all, and the trailer isn't doing anything with its framing to objectify the women's bodies for clicks.
The year was 1910. New Orleans. You could say I managed and operated a diversified portfolio of enterprises.
If by diversified you mean whorehouses, I guess. If Louis has any other types of business ventures besides the brothels, we don't know about that yet. The original casting call said he owned 8 brothels, and we know that 3 in particular were filmed during production. Jacob Anderson is from England, and he naturally speaks with a Bristol accent, so he's doing his rendition of an American Southern accent here for Louis. Another difference from the book. In Louis' time, in 1791, in Louisiana, he would have only been speaking French. He doesn't really speak English until the modern era, like when he's giving the interview to Daniel. And Daniel notices his French accent. You can read most of Louis' story in Interview with the Vampire and assume that all the characters are actually speaking French to each other the entire time. Louis, Lestat, Claudia, Armand, all of them their whole lives together. And Louis is simply translating their words to English for the sake of the interview. The characters in the 1994 movie didn't really have accents because, again, the English is just a translation and they all would have been speaking French to each other the whole time anyway. But here, in the TV show in 1910, English had become the language in the city. So Louis needs some kind of accent, and we were all wondering what direction they were going to go with it.
You could say I managed and operated a diversified portfolio of enterprises.
This direction. And next, we see Louis driving his car, showing us how well-to-do he is, and then cut to a different car driving past our first glimpse of Lestat. This is the same shot we got in the teasers a while back, and when they first dropped, the fans went wild because Lestat is wearing a coat exceedingly similar to the one that Tom Cruise wears in the 1994 movie. That had to be deliberate. This coat and hat here are rather anachronistic for 1910, and there's a few theories why Lestat might be wearing old-fashioned clothes. In the Comic-Con panel, it was confirmed that although Louis' origin was changed from the source material, Lestat's is not, so they say. He's still from the 1700s. Roland Jones said in the panel that Lestat has already come out of his relationship with Nicholas and his mother too, which only took up the first 10 years of Lestat's vampire life. And in the books, he meets Louis immediately after that. But here, what has Lestat been doing for the past 120 years? Living, learning, growing, having other fledglings, having other relationships? If so, then how will the show rationalize him still making the foolish, youthful mistakes he made in the book that were defined by his blundering inexperience? His young age when he first meets Louis was an extremely significant factor to their relationship, especially when contrasted to each of their relationships with elder vampires whenever they meet them later. However, the old-fashioned clothes here suggest that he might have just popped out of the past into the century. So perhaps he spent the entire 120 years sleeping, taking a vampire dirt nap in emotional maturity stasis, and he can still meet Louis as a fresh-faced and impulsive as the original? Well, he got this coat in the mid-1800s at some point, so who knows? That's one thing I don't actually have spoiler insider information on. We see another shot of Louis being a boss man inside the brothel, and we can see the clientele is mostly white. Louis, being a black business owner in this environment, causes him social problems, which are a key plot point in his vampire journey. Then he's walking down the street, looking very grumpy, and he passes by Lestat and tells us,
I was being hunted.
hunted. Yes. Lestat here looks just head over heels obsessed with Louis already, and let me tell you, the shippers went wild. Smash cut to Louis' family home. We know from the original casting notices that Louis' business allows his family to live in wealth, but his mother doesn't approve of the brothels, and it's a matter of contention between them. We also know that his sister's wedding is one of the big scenes in an early episode of the show. Here, we see the wedding party having a family photo taken. This is Louis' sister Grace, her new husband Levi, who the snobby, judgmental Louis disparages for being low class and country, Louis' puritanical and judgmental mom, and I'm thinking that this is his brother Paul. When everyone was talking at Comic-Con about how much more true to the book this show will be than the 1994 movie, the plot involving Louis' brother Paul is one of the things that I think that they were alluding to, because a lot of this show is not more true to the book than the 1994 movie, but Paul is. The reason Louis is susceptible to Lestat's offer of eternal undeath is because he's lost all his joy in life while he's grieving his brother after Paul falls down the stairs and dies right after Louis and Paul have a big fight about Paul saying he had this vision from God telling him that Louis need to sell all the plantations and give all their money to charity. In the movie, they changed Louis' grief to be about losing his wife and baby in childbirth, adding a no-homo layer to the character. In the TV show, Paul's religious mania has him evangelizing outside of Louis' brothels, declaring how harlotry is defiling the Lord, leading him and Louis to have a fight in the streets. But that's not when he dies. He will be dying on his sister's wedding day, not long after this photo is taken. He and Louis actually have a somewhat nice conversation together on the roof of their mansion, and then Paul just walks off the roof. Louis is horrified and confused and traumatized, not knowing if it was an accident or suicide or an act of God or what, but the guilt of the book's version immediate fight prior to the death is removed from this scene. So we'll see how that changes things. I mean, I'm sure he'll still have guilt about it in general. This is Louis we're talking about.
I was being hunted, and I was completely unaware it was happening.
Next, we see Louis at a poker game in the brothel, where time stops, and Lestat speaks to him psychically.
I've been watching you for some time now, Louis.
He's there, inside his mind. Lestat is wearing the same old-fashioned clothes as he was when he takes off his hat in the street. That red tie and black vest. At first, I thought this might mean that this poker scene happens the same night, but Louis is wearing a different clothes, so if Lestat's spending multiple nights in the same clothes, it could add to the possibility of him being an out-of-touch vampire who's been in stasis for a century, just now re-entering mortal society. The camera pans quickly past Alderman Fenwick, poor John DiMaggio's only moment in the trailer, and this other new character, the politician Tom Anderson, who unites Louis and Fenwick in a business deal while Lestat plays along and pretends to be very terrible at poker to lure them into a false sense of security, meanwhile challenging their American racism toward Louis and other black people by pretending to be confused by it because he's too French to understand. When Louis hears Lestat's voice in his head, he gives him the best what the fuck face I have seen all week at the Comic-Con panel. Besides showing this trailer, they also screened the scene where Lestat and Louis meet for the first time, which hasn't been released to the public yet. Sadness. Reporters say that in it, Louis sees Lestat flirting with one of the brothel sex workers, who Louis has this big old crush on, and Louis is jealous and broody about it. But it sure works to get his attention, and the sexual tension between them is supposedly amazing. Release the scene, we want to see it! That scene must come very shortly before this poker game scene. And next, we cut to Louis and Lestat walking down the street together in the French Quarter. This was filmed on location. The streets in New Orleans still do look like that, you know, old-timey cars aside. And look, they're friends now, and Lestat's finally dressed in contemporary fashion. We already saw a bit of this in some behind-the-scenes production footage shot by a person who lives across the street from where they were filming. This part they captured is a little bit later in their walk as they approach The Gallier House. The Gallier House is the famous historically preserved French Quarter townhouse on the Rue Royale, which Anne Rice used as inspiration for Louis and Lestat's home in the original book. So of course, the TV show had to use it for filming. You can go tour this house yourself whenever you visit the city. It is a treat, a vampire-y historical immersion. In this behind-the-scenes footage, we see a woman on the balcony waiting for Louis and Lestat to enter the house. Then the trailer cuts to show us Louis and Lestat on a date at the theater, and Lestat is discreetly touching Louis's hand with his pinky in that oh-so-classic romance trope while he stares at him with heart eyes. This vampire has got it bad, friends. We can't tell from Louis' eyes here whether he has the green contacts in or not, so any guess whether the theater date occurs during Lestat's initial seduction of him while he's human, as the trailer implies, or if it's actually a slice of life of their vampire marriage in the decades afterwards. It looks like, is that the Orpheum Theater in New Orleans? That theater is another gorgeous historical landmark, but it didn't exist until 1918, so if the scene is supposed to be at the Orpheum, then this scene is from their later life when Louis is already a vampire and Lestat is still this gaga over his murder husband. On the other hand, the historical theaters that would have been around in 1910 are sadly no longer with us for TV shows to film in, like the old French Opera House, which burned down in 1919, and the characters in the book frequented often, so this show might have just used this more modern theater to stand in for that, and this scene could still be in 1910 while Louis is still human.
I can swap this life of shame. Swap it out for a dark gift.
Considering the heavy romance of this moment, Lestat's voiceover comment about Louis' life of shame seems to refer to Louis' repressed sexuality. As he started this trailer pounding down the door of a Catholic church, it's likely he feels guilt for being attracted to a man, on top of the whole becoming a creature of darkness thing. According to the initial casting call, it's Lestat specifically who makes Louis start to question his sexuality and realize that he is queer, which is another concerning relationship trope that we are eager to see how the TV show handles. But because Louis is now a black man in this version, his shame is also conflated with the way he has to compromise his identity in order to succeed in business with white people. And his lack of privilege in this area, combined with his struggles with his sexuality and his religion, create a cocktail of motivation for becoming a vampire that explores something very different from Louis' ennui and grief in the books. Next, we cut to Louis being undressed on a couch by this woman, the same one who was on the balcony of the Gallier house in the exterior behind-the-scenes footage. So we can gather that they walked into the Gallier house, aka their house, and went upstairs to join her for a good time. The interiors of their house weren't actually shot in the Gallier house, just the exterior and the backyard. Mara Lepere-Schloop explained in her panel that they built the interior entirely on a soundstage so that they could have greater control over the environment. So this is a set, but it still mimics the original house Anne Rice based Louis and Lestat's home on. We see Louis is not really paying attention to the woman, instead staring past her to Lestat in the seat across from him. You can tell he is not that into this lady at all because his hand is curled, avoiding touching her. Lestat, meanwhile, is staring right back at him, enjoying the show, and he begins to unbutton his clothes. Then we cut to them both naked, their hands entwined romantically with fingers laced together as Lestat is about to bite Louis' neck.
You just have to ask me for it.
Ask him for the dark gift, to become a vampire. He wants Louis to do it with consent. At first, I thought from the looks of this moment that this sequence of scenes actually took place after Louis is already a vampire. Since in the books, they don't move into this house until years after Louis is a vampire, I thought that this scene might just be another slice of their daily life down the line. If that's the case, then you know this woman is probably going to get eaten and murdered as foreplay before they go off alone together to get naked. It would make sense why Louis is avoiding touching her, knowing he's about to kill her, considering his level of guilt that comes with killing. Even if this nude sex scene doesn't take place immediately after the couch scene in the actual show, the trailer is presenting it to us as a logical sequence of events for how their romance plays out, the sexual passion that arises from killing victims. In the books, the vampires don't enjoy sexual intercourse. They are capable of a mimicry of it, but it feels like nothing to them and is boring, and all they really want to do is kill the person they're with instead. Killing is all they really want, not even just drinking blood. Killing. When they become aroused, it is a bloodlust, and they feel it throughout their entire body, unlike how when Lestat is a human, he explains how his arousal is localized to his genitals. The way vampires have sex in the books is by biting each other and exchanging blood, but never actually having intercourse, and usually not even taking off their clothes to do it. And when they have sex with humans, which they do sometimes, it is always with their hands, or oral sex, never with their own genitals. And the vampire will sometimes bite the human and drink just a little bit of their blood, as well as maybe give the human a small amount of their own magical vampire blood for erotic effect. This sex scene, showing them naked, is already a step away from that lore and prompts the question of whether or not the show has changed the canon rules about vampire sex. With as much talk as there was at Comic-Con about how the queer subtext has become actual text in the show, it's possible they've changed the story to let these vampires have sex with their genitals, either with each other or between vampires and mortals, both of which are not done in the book. If they are vampires in this scene, maybe they just killed that lady and drank her blood together erotically, then got naked and drink each other's blood erotically too, or maybe the show is changing lore and they go all the way. A fan opinion is split on this idea. Instead of just having a blood drinking and killing serve as a metaphor or substitute for sex, introducing literal sex takes away from the otherworldliness and detachment from humanity the vampires have in the books. But on the other hand, it does bring more explicitly queer representation to mainstream media, which is always a good thing. More gay sex on TV is good for everyone. Trust me. Yes, it is a very different from the books. However, on closer look, I am not sure they're both vampires in this scene after all. The trailer presents it as if it's still part of the pre-change seduction, or maybe even the moment of becoming a vampire itself. We can't see Louis's eyes well enough to tell if he's wearing contacts or not, but we can see his hands. And he doesn't have the vampire fingernails. If the vampire fingernails appear immediately after he becomes undead, then he must be human in this scene, like the trailer wanted us to believe all along. Also, from the behind-the-scenes footage, as they approach the house, it looks like Louis drinking out of a flask. Vampires don't eat or drink anything but blood directly from the source. So only a human would have a flask like that. A human who probably needs a stiff drink because he's going home with a vampire who happens to have a sexy lady waiting upstairs. If that's the case, then that means Lestat already lives in the Gallier house before he even makes Louis a vampire, and that Louis doesn't kill this woman. Perhaps Lestat kills her and makes Louis watch. This is a thing Lestat does in the book. That one, he kills the overseer of Louis's plantation and makes Louis watch him die so that Louis is fully aware of what he's asking for when he makes his choice to become a vampire. Louis is horrified by it, a complete sniveling mess in the book, watching this man die. Definitely not aroused as he seems to be in this scene. That would be an interesting change, to be sure. And, if Louis is human while they're having sex, that means when Lestat bites him here, he will only drink a little bit of his blood. If this scene happens before Louis runs distraught in the rain to the church, then it can't be where Lestat makes him a vampire, just a preview of the hotness he's offering.
You just have to ask me for it.
From the sound of Lestat's voice, I think Sam Reed, who naturally speaks with an Australian accent, is doing a French accent of sorts. That would make sense, since there are several moments in the show where the characters talk about how French Lestat is. Sam Reed said at Comic-Con that he took French lessons as part of his training for this part, along with singing and dancing and piano lessons, which we don't get to see any of in the trailer, but I am very much looking forward to seeing the result of in the show. In the books, Lestat has a very subtle French accent, but that's in the modern era, so perhaps the show decided to make him have this heavier sounding accent because he's younger here, and maybe even still fresh off the boat, depending on what he's been up to for the past century. Lestat telling Louis that he has to ask him for it is similar to the choice he gives Louis in the book. Lestat was forced into becoming a vampire against his will, but he gives Louis the choice he never had. Here, that choice to become a vampire is equated heavily with the choice to be in a homosexual relationship. It's not just murder and power and immortality Louis is explicitly asking for, but also the romance. The trailer transitions here with a blurry vision of the statue, implying that now that Louis has made his choice to be a vampire with Lestat, and also his boyfriend, he is seeing the world in a different way. Cut to a shot of him with his green contacts now, his new vampire eyes. Then this clip of him and Lestat walking down the streets of Storyville, both looking rather disheveled, like they just had a roll in the hay, perhaps. The eerie quality of the way they're walking in this scene immediately after Louis becomes a vampire was achieved by having the actors walking on treadmills as the camera moves in a circle around them. Lestat's wearing the same pinstripe vest he had on in the scene on the couch, but it's unclear whether he made Louis a vampire during that sex scene or some other time entirely. I have a thought about that, which we will get to in a moment. But for now, Louis is a newborn vampire weeping at the beauty of the night, and Lestat just can't stop staring at him with those goo-goo hard eyes. The trailer then gives us a shot of a random hetero couple kissing, just to reassure the audience that this show has something for the straights too. Plenty of Storyville-era late-night sleaze. Then a montage into a glamorous event held at the Sanger Theater, filmed on location at the gorgeous New Orleans landmark that hosts touring Broadway shows to this very day. It was built in 1927, so this scene must be from later on in their vampire life together, well after Claudia joins the family, unless the show is just using this theater's lobby as a set to represent another location, which, is allowed, as you do. Louis and Lestat are in evening wear, Louis walking discreetly behind Lestat, because, just two dudes in a theater walking 3 feet apart because we're not gay. They're in a white tie here, which is different from the suits they wore in the first theater date clip we saw, so perhaps this is a gala of some kind. Interesting that neither of them are wearing gloves, unlike the other men around them. In the books, the vampire's glassy fingernails are so inhuman that they constantly keep them covered to hide their nature by rubbing stuff on them or wearing gloves all the time. But in a TV show, it's better if the audience sees their inhumanness regularly to remind us these human actors are supposed to be monsters. And then I guess we can suspend our disbelief that the other characters just conveniently don't notice. But just 2 vampires out on the town living their best life. And then the plot finally arrives. We see Louis placing a very disheveled looking Claudia down on a couch, followed by Lestat feeding her blood from his wrist to turn her into a vampire, while Louis stands behind him looking concerned. Okay, here is where that shot from the opening of the teaser belongs, along with one more clip clearly continued from that they're going to show us a little later here. Let me just put them together for you in the right order. There you go. It is Claudia who Lestat is looming over before he cuts his wrist to feed her blood. The fact that Louis isn't trying to stop him shows that this plot point is also very different from the books. When we see the close-up of Claudia's face, she's covered in sores, burns, maybe. Looks like burns to me. When Louis found her in the books in 1794, she was in a section of town that was ravaged by the plague. Her parents died, and she too would have died from the plague. He preys on her and then feels so horribly guilty for victimizing a child, even if she was going to die anyway, that Lestat gets the worst idea of the century. So because it's not plague season in 1913 when Claudia gets made into a vampire in the show, she has to be at death's door for another reason. Looking at her wounds, combined with Louis' concerned and supportive attitude, my best guess is that she was in a burning building or some other life-threatening situation, and instead of preying on her this time, perhaps Louis rescues her and asks Lestat to save her by making her a vampire. Maybe due to guilt because he caused the fire, or whatever it was that wounded her. Louis does have a thing with fire. Louis encouraging Lestat to make Claudia a vampire is a big change from the books, where it's all Lestat's idea, and he forces their shared child on Louis as a way to keep Louis from leaving him because their relationship is so horrible. In the show, it seems their relationship isn't that bad at all, and Claudia no longer serves as a baby trap, but perhaps as a mutual decision made by compassionate lovers? Fascinating. I did have the thought that perhaps this was actually a shot of vampire Claudia, who somehow got burned by the sun in her youthful foolishness, so Lestat had to heal her with his blood, because vampire blood is healing like that. But looking at what we can see of her clothes, they don't look like the finery she wears as their daughter. So I do think it's still actually human Claudia rescued from the slums. The reason I got the idea that it might be vampire Claudia getting burned by the sun, though, is because the very next shot we get is Lestat closing the Gallier house's famous skylight. We got a better view of this skylight and its shutter apparatus in one of the teasers. And the showrunners have hinted heavily that this is a plot-relevant skylight, so I'm guessing someone gets burned by the sun through it at some point. Chekhov's skylight. Perhaps it's part of the scene where Claudia kills Lestat this time, if that scene even still is in the story. The fact that Lestat is even awake to close the skylight shutter while the sun is up is another big change from the books. In the books, the vampires go unconscious the second the sun rises and cannot move or do anything until it sets again. The 1994 changed this lore as well by giving us a little scene with Claudia getting out of her coffin during the day and avoiding the sun to climb into Louis's coffin. Next, we see the bold and beautiful vampire Claudia in a sailor suit, facing off against a policeman, while her two desperate fathers run out and try to stop her from murdering him. But too late! Claudia is a force not to be denied. Caught in perpetual puberty, Claudia does what she wants. I'm wondering if this policeman is someone who's been harassing her and this is a personal revenge situation, because she does get in trouble in another scene for stealing a car and going joyriding and is brought home by the politician Tom Anderson, who has connections to the police, and he warns her dads not to let her get caught breaking the law again. Well, this cop sure won't be telling anyone. Now, we flash back to the beginning again of human Louis at the church with the priest. He's in the confessional having an extremely gay crisis for being in love with a sexy vampire man.
Bless me, Father, for I have sinned.
Cut back to Claudia in her adorable white and pink coffin going Betty Bye. In the book, she does get a coffin that's just the right size to fit her tiny body, but she never actually really even uses it. She always sleeps in Louis's coffin with him because, she's only 5 years old. But I can see why the show wouldn't want to put a 14-year-old young lady in the same coffin as Louis. So Louis and Lestat take her coffin shopping, and she chooses this pretty one for herself before they all kill the Undertaker together as a happy vampire family. Another change from the book, where in the book Lestat and Claudia kill the coffin maker alone while Louis stays home. This time Louis is there, and he's part of the mayhem, even if he's sighing heavily as he closes the shades over the windows to shield their murder scene. Next, we get another shot of Claudia inside her coffin with its pink satin lining, but clearly a different night because now her hair's down and she's covered in blood. She looks distressed, like she's in trouble, and she's wearing white. The stakes are rising! That joke doesn't really work with this franchise. There's no stakes. Next is that shot of Lestat right before he makes Claudia a vampire, then a shot of Louis getting his face caressed by Lestat's loving hand. Although Louis doesn't look especially amorous or happy, but when does he ever? He doesn't at all seem repulsed by Lestat's touch, which seems intent on comforting or reassuring him.
Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. I lay down with the devil, and I can't think nothing anymore.
In the voiceover, he's telling the priest that he's laid down with the devil. And if by laid down he means had sex instead of just the allegorical meaning, then that's another reason to believe that this naked scene actually occurs while he's still human, and now he's feeling good old Catholic guilt about it, not only his sexuality, but consorting with a murderous, blood-sucking creature of the night, especially if Lestat drinks some of his blood during sex, like it looks like he's about to here.
And I can't think nothing anymore.
No thoughts within his head, but thoughts of sexy vampires and drinking blood and being gay. Been there, Louis. Been there. We see this shot of him holding his sister's baby and his vampire fangs unsheathing, clearly desiring to eat that baby, which surely he wouldn't. He would never, would he? But he wants to. Oh, so tormented to be a vampire. About the fangs. So, in the books, the vampires have permanent fangs. Their canine teeth get a little bit longer and sharper after they become vampires, and they can hide their fangs easily if they don't smile too wide because they're not very big or anything. But when people do see them, they're incredibly freaked out, so vampires use that reveal wisely. The show has decided to go the pop culture route of retractable fangs that sheath and unsheath. Still on the correct teeth, which is nice because even the 1994 movie, which stuck with the perma-fangs, gave them a quad set. I get why the show wouldn't want to use permanent fangs because, it's harder for the actors to talk and stuff, but man, personal pet peeve, I hate retractable fangs.
Nothing!
And this apple crunching sound effect they make as they unsheath. Ugh. We have a shot of Claudia in her sailor suit again, looking ethereal and beautiful as she strolls under the street lamps, and then a shot of Lestat attacking a distracted man. From the setup of the shots, it makes it look like the man is distracted by Claudia, but looking at Lestat's clothes here, he's got his coat over his shoulders like the disheveled way he looks in the night he first makes Louis a vampire, so I'm thinking this bit is from a much earlier scene. Next, we get the full moon behind dark wafting clouds, because you can't have a vampire show without a full moon behind dark wafting clouds. And again, that shot from the first teaser bit of Louis attacking this man, followed by a very excited-looking Lestat laughing sadistically. His fangs are retracted, but he's got blood all over his face, so I guess he's finished with whatever he was doing and put his equipment away already. We got to see a wider frame of this shot in one of the official press releases from Comic-Con this weekend. Lestat is covered in so much blood. This and the following shot of the happy family all in white with blood running down their faces and all over their clothes is a huge departure from the books. One thing that's emphasized over and over is that Anne Rice's vampires do not spill a drop, and they look down disdainfully on vampires in movies who are always drooling their food out all over themselves. But like the sex and other vampire tropes, the TV show seems to want to include them, despite the source material subverting those stereotypes, for the sake of reminding the audience that these characters are indeed vampires. And there's logic to that. TV is a visual medium and needs to use visual shorthand. In the books, we get to understand their monstrousness through the first-person narration and stream of consciousness window into their souls. But they don't have to look outwardly like monsters. They blend in and fool humans. But in a TV show, the actors just blending in and looking like the rest of the human cast wouldn't exactly scream vampire show to the audience, so the show is going with vampire cliche visuals instead, no matter how much it defies canon. Next, we see Vampire Louis biting into his own arm. Note his vampire fingernails. This is from a scene where Louis has an affair with an old friend of his who's a soldier who comes back to town during the war. Louis is going through a rough patch with Lestat, he says. His libido is low, so he and Lestat have an open relationship, and Lestat is dating a blues singer named Antoinette, who is inspired by the character Antoine from the book, the young musician who Lestat makes into a vampire after Claudia tries to kill him to help him recover and get back to Louis. In the show, Antoinette shows up much earlier in the story, perhaps before Claudia is even made, and we don't know yet if she'll end up becoming a vampire like Antoine does in the books. But while Lestat is having his affair with her, Louis reconnects with his old friend Jonah, who he drives out into a secluded place, and then Jonah performs oral sex on Louis. Louis's bloodlust kicks in, and in order to keep himself from hurting poor Jonah, he bites into his own wrist. This is not a viable thing for vampires to do in the books at all. They never consume their own blood. So I am curious to see how the show has changed this lore as well. And yes, this scene confirms that the rules about vampires never wanting to have sex with their own genitals are indeed ignored for the show.
Lord, help me! I am weak! I want to die!
He just can't resist temptation. Poor Louis, vampires are just too alluring. But then suddenly, Lestat sets fire in the church and drags the priest out of the confessional and murders him for Louis to see. God, what a mess. Lestat in the books would never have spilled a drop of that blood. It would have all been in his belly. He looks absolutely feral here. And Louis looks terrified. But it's immediately followed by Lestat's voiceover.
You don't fear me, Louis. You fear yourself.
It's not the vampire monstrousness Louis fears, but his own sense of repression and shame and guilt, and what he needs is to set himself free and embrace his power. Look how conflicted and broody he is. And is that his 5th brown suit we've seen in this trailer alone? My God, Louis, please wear a different color once in a while. This church scene with the priest is an expansion of what we saw in the previous teaser. Here.
Come alive.
I give death to those deserving.
And it looks from these clips that this is a scene where Lestat makes Louis a vampire. At least that's my guess. At some point, he takes his coat off, perhaps to beat out the flames in the church, and then this would be followed by that scene where they are walking down the street together on the treadmills and Lestat's coat is back over his shoulders. Title card wipe, and an echo of the song that's been playing. Dear God, covered by Lawless, the religious themes of the music echoing Louis' struggle with his mortality as he descends into monstrousness, from one kind of monster as a capitalist brothel owner to a literal blood-drinking creature of the night. And yet, despite being a force of evil, he has so many feelings. Just look at that face. This is the pure essence of Anne Rice's vampires, that they are evil, but they still have feelings about it. And the fact that they can feel guilt and shame and pain and love, yet continue their dark existence every night is what makes them monsters. They are not forgivable, but they are sympathetic. And the story invites the audience to examine our own inherent degrees of monstrousness, as we can't help relating to the deep feelings these creatures experience. We see Lestat brutally slaughtering a priest, and yet he's still framed as desirable, tempting, alluring, though I doubt this was an innocent priest. In one of his Comic-Con interviews, Sam Reed alluded to the fact that Lestat only kills evildoers for the most part, which is in accordance with the books. And in the teaser, he says he brings death to those deserving. So I am guessing that this was an evil priest. That still doesn't make murder okay. Can't believe we have to say this. Please don't try this at home, kids. But the trailer's not over yet. We cut finally to modern times, 2022, and we see our interviewer setting up his equipment. This is an extension of a scene we got in a teaser a few weeks ago.
This is Daniel Malloy. It's 10:08 in the morning on June 14th, 2022. I ask the questions, you answer the questions. Anything that can't be verified, I send to my researcher.
Daniel is the character who interviewed Louis in 1973 in the original book. And the premise of this new show is that after Daniel did that first interview, he grew up, had a great career as a reporter, but now he's in a journalistic slump. So he wants to recapture his glory days. He pulls out his old cassette tapes of that vampire he interviewed 40 years ago, which we got to hear a bit of in the teaser here.
First question. You weren't always a vampire, were you?
No. I was a 33-year-old man when I became a vampire.
Two things about this. Louis has been aged up from 25 to 33 for a couple reasons. One, because character-wise, it gives him more time to have established himself as a successful businessman. And two, because that way the show could cast a more seasoned and experienced actor. Jacob Anderson, who plays Louis, is actually a couple years younger than that, but still playing the character as 33. Second thing is that the show will include a flashback scene to 1973 when Louis first meets Daniel in a gay tiki bar and flirts with him and then takes him home to get interviewed. And the young version of Daniel will be played by Luke Brendan Field. And I have to say that this is one of the scenes that I'm probably most excited to see. But now, in 2022, old Daniel wants to get a new story to put him back on the map. And because he did such a bad job interviewing Louis the first time when he was young, he tracks Louis down and interviews him all over again to get the real story this time, and that's our show. Daniel growing up and having a journalistic career is a huge departure from the books, because in the books, after Daniel interviews Louis, he immediately goes out looking for vampires, longing to become one after hearing Louis' story, and he meets the vampire Armand, who makes him his tortured pet for a decade or so before he finally makes Daniel into a vampire as he always wanted, which ends up utterly destroying Daniel's mental health for a long time. This version of the story, that apparently never happens. And so Daniel grows up into a completely different character. Like, he's a whole new person with a whole new life. It is a big deal. And this change has also made us wonder if Armand's story is also going to be completely changed from the books. There has been no word about the actor for Armand being cast, and he does not appear in this season at all, except perhaps in a cliffhanger at the very end of the last episode. But they are keeping the identity of the actor top secret. Why? They say it's because it's a spoiler. What does that mean? Is Armand actually someone else entirely? This season will have 7 episodes, and it only covers about the first third of the book, which sounds like it gets up to right around when Claudia kills Lestat and she and Louis run away into Europe, which is where they will end up meeting Armand. So if that's the case, Armand will be a main character in season 2, which makes me wonder, what will actor Sam Reed be doing in season 2? Surely he won't sit out most of the season. Will they write material to give him a B-plot to run alongside Louis and Claudia's adventures in Europe with Armand? Will that B-plot be flashbacks to Lestat's life story pulled straight from the book The Vampire Lestat? I can dream. But we may never get to see that part of the story. The show hasn't been renewed for a second season yet, and Roland Jones implied at Comic-Con that he thinks it might even take 3 seasons to actually tell the full story. So if you want to see the whole thing, make sure you buy AMC Plus subscriptions, like pay money for things and be loud about demand for the show. They were actually literally begging people to do this at Comic-Con. They really, really want you to pay money for the show. It's the only way they get a second season.
So, how long have you been dead?
In our very last shot of the trailer, we see Louis in modern days standing in front of a window looking out over the city of Dubai, which is where he lives now, apparently, in modern times, with his new human companion, Rashid, who is his assistant. Boyfriend? Assistant. Either way, Louis clearly not with Lestat anymore in modern times. Are they broken up forever? Or if the franchise gets future seasons and series, will we get a post-interview romantic Louis Lestat reunion like we do in the books? I initially never thought so. I thought once they broke up, that was going to be it because the Louis actor was only contracted for 1 season plus 2 episodes in a later season and nothing after that, whereas the Lestat actor was contracted for 5 seasons, but seeing how hard they're going on the romance now, maybe there'd be more chance at any future at all if Louis wasn't standing in front of a plate glass window at 10 o'clock in the morning? This part baffles me. How is he immune to this sunlight that is very clearly coming through the window right now? If he's immune, why is that skylight in the Gallier house plot relevant? Why are they creatures of the night at all? Well, we'll find out, won't we? The last bit of news we get is the official release date, October 2nd. And according to Comic-Con News, the first 2 episodes will be out on October 2nd at 10 p.m. after The Walking Dead on AMC. 2 episodes the first day, supposedly. So then if we get an episode every Sunday after night, it means the show will run until November 6th. So set your calendar alarms, plan your watch parties, and get hype, because this show is going to be a ride. Yes, very different from the source material, no matter how many times the cast and showrunners said at Comic-Con that it is closer to the books than the movie, actually. I'm guessing that they meant more in the sense of vibes. And also, they promise that the show includes tons of Easter eggs and direct quotes from the books, and that we will be surprised by how accurate it is. I guess because nowadays people automatically assume TV show adaptations are going to be so widely changed from the source material that they'd be unrecognizable. But surprise, there will actually be some interview with the vampire in this interview with the vampire. You're welcome. I am the Maven of the Eventide, and I have so much more I could tell you about this show, but spoilers. Maybe we'll get a second trailer and we can talk about it more. This trailer was so focused on the romance between Lestat and Louis that it shows nothing really of all the other characters and plots going on in the world around them. If they release another trailer to show that side of the story, perhaps even to cater more strongly to the straight side of the audience, because, you know, I could see why they would want to do that. Believe you, I will be back and we will go even deeper. And if not, well, you will be seeing much more of me once the show airs. That is a promise. If you'd like more of my thoughts and feelings and opinions about Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles, check out the few other videos about it I've made on my channel already, and also I am working on another one coming up very soon, and if you would like to help support me making that video based on one of the books, analyzing the book, a deep dive, you can do that on my Patreon. Please join my Patreon if you would like to help me make more of these videos. Otherwise, please help the algorithm find this video, share it with your friends, spread the news, answer the questions, what's going on with the Anne Rice TV show. You know a little bit more now, but not as much as I do.